Okay, yeah, we're recording.
All right, sounds good. Hey, everyone, welcome back. All right. Okay, so we're going to try to finish up in the next 35 minutes or so, kind of the content, including probably 10 minutes or so on a breakout exercise, and then make sure that we leave some time at the end for some questions as well. So project started. One of the first things that I noted that we did in our first 90 days was establish a governance structure. So wanted to share with you a little bit about what a governance structure looks like on a large project like this or program. And it's big, right? This is where some of the overhead comes in. But you need effective management and steering and status reporting and paths for escalation in order to help make sure that a team this size doesn't get bogged down. When you think about what that total spend is, your burn rate on a day-over-day basis is massive, and so you can't afford to be spinning your wheels at all. And so you need ways to make sure that things are on track, and that you're reporting your status accurately and effectively, and able to ask for help when you need it really quickly. So top down here, we had a program executive steering committee. This met monthly. We talk about status, we talk about what was coming up, areas where we needed help or guidance, or if we needed approvals. And this is kind of at your vice president, senior vice president level at the bank. A level down from there, a program steering committee met biweekly, sort of the direct reports of the people that were in the executive steering committee. So key stakeholders, folks that were responsible for some of the business and technology areas that were being impacted by our program, that needed to be aware of what we were doing. That's really kind of your high level governance and decision making in the navy blue. The next level down becomes much more within the direct purview of the project or program itself. So we had a weekly, what we call the program operating group. This is a classic, status report. Each of the work streams would report on how are they doing, how are they progressing against plan, key accomplishments in the last week, what's coming up in the next week, and what are their major risks or issues or roadblocks, and share that. A level down from that, we start getting closer into the daily activities. So we had a scrum of scrums. We met twice a week, where the scrum masters from those different streams met up along with the delivery leads and talked about any impediments that they were facing, or sharing things that were working well. And then we had daily scrums for each of the 4 different streams, as well as whatever cadence was needed for the kind of more waterfall style projects that we're delivering. And then we had the different teams that were representing different functional areas, where they had different resources in there that were really kind of spanning across all of these different teams. So there were product owners everywhere. There was a BA lead, a tech lead, the PMO obviously playing a role there, and so on. And then outside of that, we had, in the green, we had some different approval mechanisms that were part and parcel of a regular cadence of approvals. So we had the Experience Design Authority that reviewed the UX and the UI components that we were building to make sure they were in line with the banks, and they would approve those. Similarly, we had technical approvals that were required for the architecture and the solution design. And then there were briefings to the business stakeholders and our CIO as well. So very classic. I use this kind of a structure, a little bit lighter, a little bit heavier on any smaller or bigger program as required, but it scales really nicely. So on a smaller project, you might have just fewer stakeholders in the stuff up top, for example, and a more frequent or maybe slightly less formal cadence of updates and a way of keeping people appraised of what's going on. Okay. So just a quick note on client relations. What we talked about there was a formal governance structure and a way to manage a program. The formal stuff's really important. You also need to be aware of the informal channels. So and to do that really well, you've got to kind of combine the two, right? You have all the formal stuff because it's important and things need to be documented and structured. But informally, you got to figure out how your client likes to communicate. Might not always be via email. People drown in email. You need to know whether they like phone calls, text messages, both, early in the morning, after hours, and build, use that to get in touch with them, keep them aware of what's going on. And then the other recommendation is just building an approach to escalation as well. Escalation is when you need to ask for help. There's an external vendor coming in and providing leadership and a significant big team in here. Again, any roadblocks cost a lot of money if there's downtime and people are not productive. And so you need to be able to show very quickly that you're making your client aware of that and that they're engaged to help resolve it as soon as possible. So you need an effective way to escalate as well. All right, quick comment on building and integrating. We talked a bit about how we were organized and structured as a team, and the fact that we used a combination of agile and waterfall hybrid. Very, very common in large organizations, especially in banks. Getting to pure agile is extremely rare. It does happen, but usually financially they're just not set up for it. So what we often find is that because agile is a great way to build software, we do as much of it as we can within the constraints of the organization. And so you typically end up with a lot of agile delivery principles while still kind of falling within the boundaries of some sort of fixed budget or fixed timeline or fixed scope that's classically associated with waterfall. What we found is that each layer in the stack, from the UI down to the channel services, the enterprise service bus, and the product systems, had their own teams. As we talked about already, they had their own delivery approach and their own release cadence. And as you move from the top of the stack, you're down at the bottom, you go from highly flexible to very rigid. So you get a lot more flexibility and agility when you're doing the front end work. And as you move down the stack away from channel services into the ESB, enterprise shared services, the services are shared. So if you're modifying one, you need to do regression testing with all the other consumers. That immediately reduces your agility. And then the product systems are the ones that are the most rigid. They need to be well protected. Even minor changes need to be bundled up as part of a quarterly release with a lot of rigorous testing of the change itself and regression testing to make sure nothing else is broken. So it's just interesting to note, as you move down through the stack, you become a little less agile and a little more rigid. Very, very common. Not a good thing or a bad thing. You just need to plan for it. We talked a bit about QA. The QA plays a huge role in the team and in making sure that we're meeting requirements and we're not breaking anything along the way. So we did a whole slew of different kinds of testing on this project. It's very standard. So unit testing, the devs are responsible for that. You write your own unit tests. We did something called development integration testing. So in between the developer's laptop and the SIT environment, we had a DIT environment, develop integration testing, loosely controlled, but you could check in your code. It gets merged with everyone else, and you start running some testing on there as an early shakedown to make sure things are working well and nothing breaks. Then you get into SIT for system integration testing. This is an enterprise-owned and operated environment, so a bit more rigor in terms of what gets deployed into it. And there's other consumers and people using stuff in there as well. So you need a way to manage change in the environment and manage what's going on in terms of test data, potential downtime as people are deploying code in there, and so on. We did user acceptance testing. The business comes in and runs a set of test cases, typically different from what you're doing in SIT. And then there's non-functional testing as well, which is all the performance testing, and then the operability and failover testing that you do as well to make sure that the system meets all its NFRs for uptime and performance under load. We talked a little bit about test automation. If you remember on the kind of the operating model, we had both manual testers and automation testers in our QA teams. And test automation, awesome. I mean, there's amazing tooling out there for this now. You can build a whole career around this if you get into it. Test automation is a lot more like development than manual testing is. You need a QA mindset, but you're writing code, scripts essentially, to test the application. And it's definitely, from a project perspective, it's absolutely worth the investment in this. It's a key part of DevOps. It allows for kind of continuous integration, continuous deployment. You build regression test suites that run automatically every time code is deployed, and that validates that nothing's broken when you bring code into that next environment. What I will say for projects like this, a big lesson learned that we tried to automate too early when the UI was still quite fresh and undergoing a lot of change. And every time you moved a button or moved a field somewhere, you had to rewrite all of your test scripts that were associated with that screen. So that was a lot of extra rework as well. So we probably would have been better off just doing more manual testing up front and leaving leaving some of the automation scripting until later in the project when some screens had stabilized a little bit more. Lost some time doing that. A way to get around that, I mentioned it in the last bullet here, you can just do automation testing at the API layer, so at the services layer. So don't worry initially about testing up front through the screen, but just do it at the API layer and make sure that the data is working and being exchanged between your services as required, both happy path and unhappy path. And that is typically those APIs go through a lot less change than the screens. And the graphic at the right just talks about, you want to find your defects as early as possible. So the more testing you can do early on, the better off you are. It gets harder to test as you move kind of up the stack and into production, and it gets a lot more costly as well along the way. All right. In terms of QA, functional testing and operating model, just along the top here, we talk about sort of classical phases in testing. From the initial planning and developing the scenarios to actually writing the test cases, whether they're going to be executed manually or automated, doesn't matter. You got to figure out what you're going to test. You need to set up the data, and then you actually execute the tests, validate them, and then produce reports on a daily basis. What passed, what didn't, and so on. So that's a very typical kind of structure or flow through the QA lifecycle. And there's different roles. The QA team obviously plays a large role in it, but so do BAs and product owners in terms of defining the requirements. They really help set the stage for what we're going to test. And the developers have, a lot of input as well into the testing. And of course, they need to work hand in hand with the QA team once defects are found to help resolve them. All right. So QA developers, I think, this is of course more focused on development than QA, but just some things that, what I think devs should know and understand about QA. First is QA is a partner. They're not there to, they are there to keep you safe. They're there to catch defects that might be there in your code, but that's a normal part of software development. And it's a good thing. So you want to view QA as a partner, not as someone that's there to kind of check your work, but really keep everybody safe, and they're a key part of the success of the project. And I would encourage developers to really adopt a QA mindset. And by that I mean, don't just code for the happy path. That's easy. It's the edge cases. It's the things that might go wrong that you also need to code for, and that's harder, frankly, and more challenging and more interesting. So rather than just thinking, and I started out my career as a developer, as I mentioned, at Deloitte. So generally you're about problem solving and how can I make this work, especially when you're starting out your career. It's easy to think, yep, I'm done, right? I answer the happy path and the easy path, and I'm done. What you want to do is take a step back and think, how could I break this? How can I break the code that I just wrote, and start coding to adapt to that and fix that? And think about things like permutations in data. This happens all the time in complex systems, where the problem is not just coming from the function itself, but actually the underlying data is not what you expect. And you need to be able to handle that and handle it gracefully. And also environments as well. We run into this all the time, and boy, you waste a lot of time when you're trying to debug something and you get into arguments as to whether it's environment related versus code related versus data related. You need to anticipate a little bit that your environments are going to be different, and try to build your code to be a bit flexible in that regard. Any questions about QA for developers? Okay, spending a couple slides on release management, and just to give you an idea of what that's like, especially in a large enterprise. So a lot of effort is required for getting approval to release your code to production, especially if it's first time. So a new platform build like what we're talking about here, or any major code releases. So what we're finding too is that, well, banks and other large organizations are developing DevOps practices, which streamlines things technically through continuous integration, continuous deployment, and so on, and some of that built-in regression testing. The gating and approvals have not really kept pace, and a little bit with some good reason. Just that overall, the kind of the level of maturity just isn't there and equal on all sides of the board, in order to still be able to usher code in safely on an automated way without these additional manual checks and balances. So, and it's more than just paperwork. It does serve an important function. You've got to make sure that there's been considerations given to impact to the customer, any system downtime that might occur that would affect customers or people internally from doing their jobs, as well as regulatory requirements that might exist. So things that you need to think about when you're looking at the life cycle of your project and managing it, you may very well be locked into a standard release cycle, and like a quarterly release. And if so, you need to plan for that and plan really far in advance to get into that and participate in their collective integration testing and regression testing that they're doing for all of the participants in that release. If you're lucky, you can go as an independent, and that comes with its own set of challenges. You're not tied to the release necessarily, but then you're jockeying to find open change windows where big releases that are already in plan, they've taken up a weekend and no one else is allowed to go on a given weekend. So you're looking for the 1 or 2, 3 weekends in a month where you've got some availability, some change windows that are open, as it were. And that's that last piece there, which is the need to kind of negotiate and figure out what a contention-free date is. And there's a lot of stuff that kicks in that could prevent you from getting the windows you want. And it's important to know this because, again, at the cost, the daily cost of a project like this one, every day counts. So if you're bumping up, your go live is in early February, and you start slipping by a week or two, you're now into, at a bank, an RRSP change freeze for 4 weeks. They don't allow any changes in during RSP season because they don't want to risk bringing any systems down. So if you slip by a week there, you might have just lost a month, right? And that's really expensive. So you've got to plan for this, and you need to plan for contingency dates as well along the way. So what you would typically do when you're setting out a big 18 to 24 month schedule like that is you'd spend a lot of time with enterprise release management at the bank to look at their change calendar. What are their big weekends that they've already blocked off a year in advance when they've got huge releases going in? And what are the other windows that you might have available that you can start playing with, and you kind of work backwards from that. And again, have dates and contingency dates along the way. Typical gating criteria for getting into production is listed here. There's a whole host of stuff. I'm not going to go through it all in detail. We touched on some of them already, but you've obviously got to prove that you've gone through all of your testing, you've passed it, you've got a plan in place to communicate out to everyone. You've done the comms, you've done the training, the implementation plan. You know what your playbook and your run book is going to look like for the night or the weekend that you're doing your deployment activity. You've got all the blessings you need from InfoSec and security. Systems are ready to receive it. You've done some potential problem analysis. You've thought ahead to what problems might arise, and you've already got a playbook set up for tackling those problems if they do happen during the event. And at what point you fall forward versus fall back. In other words, keep fighting through the problem in order to resolve it versus rolling back to the previous version of the code or just removing it. You've done all your conversion events, and you've got your pilot plan is ready, and IT ops is ready to support and operate and monitor your new system in production once it's actually gone live. Any questions there about anything here? All right, just having a quick look at the. All right, let's touch on the networking for developers in Toronto in a bit. Maybe we'll leave that one to the end if that's okay.
Yeah.
Okay, a few slides on DevOps. I was chatting with Rich last week about this. I think you're doing a lot of this, maybe without necessarily calling it DevOps. DevOps is a combination of development and operations. It's becoming more and more mainstream and normal. To be honest, it was a new thing several years ago. It's becoming less and less of a new thing and just more a standard way of operating. Certainly in the areas within banks, for example, where they have the technology that can support it and enable it. But really, it's allowing a quick flow of work from dev through to operations and ultimately out to the customer. It's built around a lot of agile principles, but it applies more to getting code into operations as opposed to getting the requirements through to code. So there's a lot of feedback loops there. That's where you have things like the use of automated QA becomes so critical because you can deploy code automatically, it gets integrated, and then you run some automated regression suites and make sure everything is still working. There's I guess the other principle here is a high trust culture, continuous experimentation and learning And that's the one probably which takes the most time at the large organizations like the banks is developing a culture that actually allows for this, allows for risk taking and really kind of being able to introduce some faults into the system to test and validate and create resilience. So what I found is that as we do this in our projects, which are in and of themselves fairly transformational in nature, we can get the first one done. We can start building in using a lot of the DevOps tooling, the ability to get that code deployed quickly and safely in an automated way. You can almost always get that one done. The second one, the feedback loops, if you can extend the tooling and get the operations teams to buy into it, you may be able to tackle that one as well and learn along the way in an automated way through automated reports and so on. It's almost impossible in a single project to just tackle culture. Each one kind of builds on top of the other, but you're more reliant on the organization itself to really sponsor that and help drive that. So you can push for it, but I would say you can't count on it. You've got to figure out, you've got to, as part of getting your project done in time, you've got to work around and through whatever you have available to work with. So classic DevOps value stream, build, test, release, deploy, operate, monitor, and then plan for changes again and go back through the coding and building, testing, and so on. And there's a whole host of different tooling along the way. These are some industry standard ones. There's many, many more that are out there. These are a lot of the ones that we see and use both at Capco and with our clients, the banks. I mentioned Confluence and Jira at the top left. And earlier on some other context with more related to business requirements and QA as well. And that's where having a solution set for DevOps that is well integrated, and they don't all need to be the same thing. These can be integrated together, but really supports your end-to-end delivery. Our DevOps pipeline that we built had a combination of cloud and on-premise components to it. A lot of our development work was done in the cloud. We had our build automation stuff that was there. We were pulling code, creating a branch, merging the branch using Bitbucket, Jenkins, Buddy Build, and so on, pulling together our front-end code and our channel services. It ultimately ended up in Artifactory, and then we pushed it into the bank's data center, where we further, through automation, build automation on OpenShift and channel services, got that deployed out into the various containers and the environments, whether it was the SID environment, the performance environment, or production. What's really interesting now is this was from 2017, 2018. And even in the span of the last 2 to 3 years, more and more of the bank's applications are moving into the cloud. So a lot of the stuff you see there in kind of the lighter blue is now starting to move up, where really that cloud network is extending down across more and more components at the bank. And we're seeing this broadly across all the banks in Canada are making a bigger and bigger move into public cloud, which is great because it's generally speaking just a more efficient way to work. Any questions about this? I think we're going to shift to our exercise right now. We've got about 10 minutes left, so I think the timing's decent, Rich.
Yep.
Okay. Our project experienced 3 major changes in those 18 to 24 months. We're going to focus on the first one and just ask you to think a little bit about that in your group. So change is going to happen, right? It's to be expected, and you just need processes for effectively dealing with change because it's going to happen for sure. So we're going to talk about the first one, which is something called eKIF. Was not available for storing the customer data. And I think I've got a slide on that here. Okay, so the customer data repository. So eKIF stands for Electronic Customer Information File. That's a common term used for customer data at banks. And here was our challenge. We were moving from an old online banking system to a new one. Remember, we talked about the data conversion process that we were going through, and that old online banking platform had a proprietary database for customer data that was not shared with the rest of the organization. And this was a big issue because they wanted to extract it out of there and get it into the enterprise store for customer data. So it could be used not just for online banking, but for banking in general. And we were told originally that we had to get it over into the eKIF platform. And so we built our conversion scripts to get the data out of the old and into the new eKIF. And we built all of our authentication, channel services, and ESB services to connect into eKIF. The problem is there was still work going on that eKIF platform. And while it was supposed to be ready in time for us, they ran into some problems. And they were no longer, that data repository was no longer going to be ready in time for our go live. And we needed to come up with another alternative way to store the customer data that was coming off of the old platform and onto the new one, and figure that out pretty quickly. So I think the assignment in your groups, Rich, and I'll need your help there, but the assignment's down at the bottom, is what are the questions that you need to answer in order to figure out what alternative you could use for storing the customer data? And then how would you tackle the problem? Those are kind of the two questions that we'd like you to try to answer as a team.
So I'm going to just enable my share for a second and show you where to go. So in week 9, there is a link here that says, it says lesson 11 because my calendar is a bit messed up. So if you open up this file, this lesson 11 team slides, it'll open up a PowerPoint slide deck. Please open it in your browser, don't download it. So if you hit edit in browser, I'm going to start the breakout rooms, and you should now be able to move yourself into the appropriate room. So our question, actually, each team has a slide. So the actual problem is here on slide 7. So I've replicated Sean's slide. So here's the visual of the problem, that this eKIF database, new eKIF system is not going to be available. So each team, you have a slide. I've put your name. So Amplify, you've got slide 8 in kind of the dark red. HCBJ, you're on slide 9. Ontario Digital Life, you've got slide 10. Sorry, Style Squad, this is you guys. So slide 11. And Code Dictionary, you have slide 12. So I'm going to start the breakouts. It won't take a lot of time, maybe 8-9 minutes in the breakouts only. So you can refer to slide 7 as the problem and work together in your breakout. So you should actually be able to move yourself into your appropriate breakout room. I'll bring us back around 10:45 and we can kind of compare notes and see what are in your slides. And then we'll have a little bit of time for just sort of a general question and answer session with Sean. Okay, so I will start the breakouts and then you should be able to just move yourself into the appropriate room. So I'll set it that you can choose your session. So just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So just join the breakout room that corresponds with your team number. And I'll start them now. So you should be able to just move yourself. You can just join the breakout session. And I will pause the recording while we do this. This is so young, you should be able to move yourself. So Sean, did you want to re-enable your share and we can have a quick look at everyone's feedback? I can also do it if it's easier.
Can you do that if you don't
Yep.
mind, Rich? Yeah, thanks. I don't have that open right now.
Okay, no problem. All right, so let's look at some of your feedback. Okay, so okay, you guys are still typing, so we'll maybe jump at slide 11. Yeah, so find a kind of a temporary database that we can work with for the amount of data, but also that can scale. So yep, the scaling ability, and try to find something that will also be flexible in terms of the framework we've already got. Okay?
Yep.
Thanks. Group team 4, and we'll come back to team 5. Team 2. Yes, so we'll need to know, we do need the customer data to be able to manage the accounts. And yes, we are going to need some kind of alternative storage. If that eKIF database isn't available to us, we're either going to have to stick with the legacy database for now or find another storage option. Okay. Okay, so part of the decision, yeah, are we looking at a relational or a NoSQL database?
Mm-hmm.
That is definitely
considered. That'll really be driven by the requirements, right? Yep. And what technology can meet the requirements.
Yeah, and Team 5 also asked, can we use the legacy database if that new one isn't ready yet? Or do we have to look at some sort of temporary storage mechanism?
Yep. That's great. Both of those good options, right?
Okay, I even have it here, I think. So Sean, what slide number I can just share from here? Where we can actually...
36.
Okay, so here's what they actually did. So we'll run through this quick, and then we'll add a little bit, allocate some time for any general questions you'd like to ask Sean.
Yeah, sounds good. I would have loved to have had a little more time to go through your, give you more time as a team to talk about it and then go through it, but we're a little pressed for time. So here's what we did. There's 2 slides on this one so quickly. So the kinds of questions we asked, and you've asked some of them on your slides, which is great. So what other bank systems are going to need access to the same data? And what systems are they using? And so, where did we check in? So we checked in on the right as a list of like who we asked the questions to. So enterprise architecture, data governance, and so on. What repository could we use for this? Again, architecture and data governance, and whatever this new database is, will it meet all the requirements? So you're talking about SQL or NoSQL, temporary versus using the existing, what needs to change if we're going to move to a new one, and what code would be rewritten. So there's the question of which database, and then there's the impact to the code, and some of the teams touched on this as well. How much rework is going to be needed on the channel services and the enterprise services layer to connect up to a different database than what was originally envisioned as part of the solution design. Well, how are we going to rework our testing? So if you rework your code, you've got to redo some of your testing as well. What testing that you've already done and closed off would need to be opened up again and redone? Where would you need regression testing, etc.? What's the impact on the data conversion stream? So not just the code for the application, but also where how you're bringing the data out of the old and into the new. Would we need to change batch jobs as well that are running overnight based on that data that's in there, and any changes to alerts as well? So these were 2 items. I didn't talk about them in great detail in terms of our solution, but other considerations that needed to be done beyond the day-to-day functioning or the user level functioning of the system, but things like batches that run overnight that draw data from that repository, and any alerts that might get sent off and triggered by data changes in the eKIF database, all needed to be considered. So really quickly, I think I got 60 seconds here. We ended up selecting the core banking system. We decided we could not stay on the old. It was going to cost too much money to keep the old legacy platform running strictly for the database only. So that for monetary reasons, that one was taken off the table. That was a good suggestion by one of the teams to look at. So we did look at that. Going to be too expensive. So we went with using the core banking system for the customer data. We had to add some fields to it, and we then cut all of the code that we'd written already. We set that aside for a point in time in the future when that eKIF database was eventually brought online. We could reuse that code, bring it back in, and connect up to that. So we had to redo the whole plan. and rework work on the channel services layer, including data conversion, and also the ESB layer as well. So all told, it was about 500, almost 600 days of effort. So again, a non-trivial change. In this case, that was really just caused by another project out there in the enterprise not meeting their own timelines. So that was a big hit, and one of the reasons why we ended up taking a bit extra time and costing more money on this project than we originally envisioned. All right, there are a few other slides. I know that in here, we're not going to go through them right now. I believe Rich has posted these in the usual repository. And we have a few questions that are at the end, Rich, but we could just open this up first of all to see if folks do have any questions that they want to ask on the content or ask me. Feel free to come off mute and ask them or post them in the chat. Otherwise, Rich, I think we can jump ahead to slide 43 if you want.
Sure.
I just have a quick question.
Yeah.
So this is for you. What is your advice when preparing for your first interview in getting your first kind of job in tech?
So I think I'm going to guess your first interview is probably going to be a video interview now, which is sort of newish. So I would say, prepare a little bit for that. Maybe grab a classmate or a friend, and do some practicing with that in terms of answering the question, through the camera and so on. That's very, we've been doing this for a year, so maybe that's not such a big deal. And then I think I would spend some time online thinking, researching the kinds of questions that you're likely to get asked. And I bet Jordan's got some good, resources for that as well. And prepare some answers ahead of time. One of the things that we also do is we'll do coding challenges as well if you're applying for a developer job. So there might be some of that. So you might want to research the kinds of, make sure that you're feeling pretty comfortable with the kinds of technology that they mention in the job posting. And if there's, if you cover some of it but not all of it, let the recruiter know ahead of time that, hey, I'm good in the following 3 things, but I don't know so much about this last one that you've mentioned, so that they know that they shouldn't spend time giving you a test that's designed on that one area. Does that help? Just some initial thoughts there.
Yes, thank you.
No problem.
I would add, you should always have some questions. A job interview, so a candidate who has when the employer says, do you have any questions? If you have no questions, that's not a great sign.
You're absolutely right, Rich. You really want a dialogue, right? This is, I know it seems daunting when you're early on in your career, but you are also assessing whether you want to go work for this organization or not. And to be honest, right now, it's a hot market. There is, we've talked for years about a war for talent, but it's very real. So it's, you are in the driver's seat a bit as well here. So you should ask questions that you want to know about the organization, about the work expectations, the kind of work you'll tackle, what the culture's like, to get a, and how you can get a good sense of what it would be like to actually work there.
Other questions for Sean?
I have a couple of questions, actually. I hope that's okay.
Go ahead.
So the first question is, so I know some people like myself don't have experience. So what I did during the first wave of pandemic, so I reached out to small businesses, like some friends I met through Sandbox and everything. And I was like, you know what, like I can try to make a website for you and I can build my portfolio. And it didn't turn out very well because I was using a drag and drop and I had like no clue with servers. So instead of like doing something for like a month or 2, it turned out like really more than that. I had to troubleshoot here and there. So for someone who's trying to break through and trying to build a portfolio and like look for volunteering opportunities like I did, how would you recommend to start, or would you recommend like another way or another route kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, I think first of all, like it's what a great learning experience you've just gone through, right? I think you could even use that in an interview question at some point about if someone says, tell me about a time that something didn't go well, right? Or didn't go as planned, and what did you do, and how did you recover? Tell me about it. So that might be a very good example, Emily, you want to use at some point in a future interview. In terms of volunteering and so on, I think I would start with not-for-profit organizations or smaller organizations in the community that might be looking for some help in this area, and see how you could get involved. Community organizations, and they might be physically in your area, or they might just be online, available kind of in something that you're interested in. And I'd say stick with your interests, right? Like try to find something that lines up with stuff that you're personally interested in, because you'll be more motivated to spend some time on it. Rich, do you have any other thoughts or suggestions on that one?
One other option is if you're taking on those sort of projects on your own, when you're just learning, I mean, one of the important things is having some mentorship and some collaboration. So one suggestion is to look at those initiatives, but do it with somebody, even if it's another peer, because you may have strengths that you don't have. So that's somebody that you can help each other, as opposed to when you're all on your own, if you get stuck, you're not necessarily sure where to turn.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you.
Anybody else have any other questions for Sean? Career advice, other things about this project, or other things about his background that you'd like to know while we still have Sean here with us?
Sorry, I have another question. So I know sometimes, like when you have a job posting and it says like 2 years. Normally it's like 2 years experience and you don't have it. They tell you like still apply. How do you pass? Because everything is online. So I know there's a portfolio, but everything is online. So how do you pass this first screening? If the answer, especially like it's auto-filled on Indeed and you don't have any experience, like how do you get your foot in the door? One option I found is I don't know if people are bothered by it or not. I actually call the company and ask to talk to them and say, for example, what I did last week, I was like, I know you have a job posting and I don't have that much experience, but I would like to, I saw this job posting, I have this much experience, but I like this much experience in that. Can I work for free for you? And I don't know if calling them is going to bother them or it's a good thing to do.
I think it's a good thing to do. I think it is. I think applying to job postings is important and necessary, but I don't think it's the only thing you should be doing. So I think doing what you did there, which is placing a call, trying to reach someone, I think is fantastic. And I think another avenue to pursue is really through trying to build a network. So target a few organizations that you're interested in a particular sector that you're interested in, or if you know that you want to work at a certain company. And using LinkedIn, using your network from school, friends, and so on, try to find your way to get to talk for 10 minutes over a virtual coffee with someone that works there. Try to network your way in a little bit. I think every single job I've ever had, I've ended up not getting through a job posting. I still applied to many of them online, or even before it was online, and I think almost all of them I've ended up getting through some kind of a personal connection. And in most cases, it wasn't even necessarily a strong connection. So it was just, someone who knew someone, they suggested we get together, talk, and you'd be amazed at how that can kind of open things up. So I'd say, make sure that is part of your plan, is to do some networking that way when you're looking to land a job somewhere.
And my last question is that when you're a fresh grad, how do you deal with imposter syndromes? For example, there's a job posting that says a front end does, for example, either front end or interactive media says that UX and Photoshop and all this, and like you've done that in your course, but you're like, oh, I'm not like as good as a graphic designer, or I'm not as good as a full stack developer, but you're just out of school, like just school projects. So how do you tackle with that imposter syndromes and kind of put yourself out there and be like, yes, I can do it and stuff like that?
So I think Emily, your question is like, if you don't have all of the items that they're asking for in the job posting,
yeah,
how do you still go ahead and do that? I think you've got to there's two parts to that, right? One is first getting the foot in the door, so getting you know, for an interview, and then once you're there, you know, wowing them with your abilities and what your, you know, your attitude and what you would bring to the table and so on. So I think trying to convey that somehow through the posting for sure is part of the challenge, and it depends on how you you know, how the application form is structured or the process and so on. I think there's
My fear,
yeah.
my fear is that I can apply for a job and then I'm afraid that they might be disappointed. They might be like, "Oh, I thought you would be able to do that, but I shouldn't be hiring a student because, like, yeah, they have some lacking and stuff like that."
I see. Okay. So, I mean, I think, you know, honestly, I think none of us ever feels 100% confident that we can come in and do something unless we're overqualified for the job, right? Like, I think there's always risk out there. You know, I've been doing this for over 25 years. I still get butterflies when I start a new project. You know, and there's things I know that I'm going to encounter that I have never done before, and I'm going to have to figure it out. And you know what, you will figure it out, and you're not the only person going through this, right? Everybody goes through this. So you know, you count on kind of your ability to figure things out. You count on some of the great training you're doing here and elsewhere, and you know that it's going to be a journey, right? You're not going to know everything day one, but you're going to have the attitude to keep an open mind and to adapt and figure things out as you go along.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Right, and I think there was a question about, oh yeah, you've answered it already. I think a question from Hung. That's probably where I would have said as well. Hung, what I can offer is I'll also talk to some of my dev colleagues at work and see if they also have any other online networking communities that they're involved in, and I'll share that back through Rich.
Okay, everyone. So some excellent questions. I've posted the full slide deck, so there are some other slides in here. So those are on Blackboard in the Lesson 9 folder. There is no homework for this week other than you should be working on your final assignment. And please make sure you're keeping track of your task progress on FreedCamp, as well as logging all of your time, because that usage does get